Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And before we get into today's podcast, if you've had to take time off work because of injury or illness, then you need a strong player on your team. Maurice Blackburn is Australia's #1 super claims law firm. They can check if your insurance is as part of your super and help you make a super TPD claim. Maurice Blackburn fights for fair. Call them on 1800 111 222 or go to mauriceblackburn.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive issues, campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, we're going to be rejoined by a guest that we had on not so long ago, Ittay Flescher, who is a journalist with Plus 61J in Jerusalem. He's also the education director for Kids for Peace in Jerusalem, which is a youth movement that supports young Israeli and Palestinian kids. Obviously, in the news in the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's been a flare up and tensions and escalation of violence in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. And it's not an easy topic to cover. It's very heated. A lot of people have opinions. A lot of people manage to get those opinions down to a very simple meme and put it up on Instagram. So we thought we would unpack those memes and actually get Ittay on today's show to talk us through how the hell we got back to another cycle of escalating violence in the Middle East. And so we appreciate him coming on the show to talk to us about that. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Instagram. On what do you call it? I've just lost my notes again. This has been one of the worst introductions I think I've ever done. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or Stitcher, and to follow Dunn Street on our social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Oh my God! Let's just get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon in downtown Melbourne, and joining me on the line from Jerusalem is the Jerusalem journalist for Plus 61J, and he's also the education director for Kids for Peace Jerusalem, which is a youth movement for Israeli and Palestinian youths. He's been on the show before, but it's great to welcome you back onto Socially Democratic. Ittay Flescher, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, the last time I had you on the show, I said, because I loved the conversation talking about the Israeli elections, and I said, I think you'll be back on pretty soon because you'll have elections again quite soon, making a stupid joke. Unfortunately, you're actually back on the show, but not under great circumstances because of obviously the what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. But we certainly do appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on to the show and talk to us about what has been happening in your neighbourhood in the last couple of weeks. My first question really is first of all, how are you and your family going since the conflict escalated over a fortnight ago?
So thanks for asking. And look, my family is okay. I live in Jerusalem in the Emek Rephaim neighbourhood, where we thankfully haven't experienced violence. There weren't rocket attacks in this area. Specifically, there was one rocket on Jerusalem on the first day of the war, but aside from that, I was fine. But definitely for my kids, they had obviously their school excursions cancelled, the camping trip was cancelled. Most schools, pretty much for the 2 weeks of the war in Israel, didn't allow any outdoor activities because, they wanted kids to be indoors so they could be close to the to a bomb shelter. It was almost like the opposite of Corona. For the whole past year, they've actually said do everything outdoors. So my kids were doing school outdoors, and now obviously changed to move everything to indoors. But a lot of people in the country obviously experienced the war in a much more terrible way than I did, and I'll speak about that as we go on.
Well, I mean, that's great. Certainly great to hear that things are certainly okay with your family. So I'm pleased to hear that. Look, and when this happened, I must admit, I thought to myself, do we do a podcast on this issue, because it is such a complex and long-standing geopolitical conflict that I don't think you can do it justice in a 40-minute, 50-minute podcast. But I certainly want to give it a crack. And I think the thing that drove me to wanting to do it is I was getting sick of people trying to sum up the conflict in a meme, which is the complete opposite of having a conversation. So I do appreciate you coming on the show to talk about it today. How did this contemporary conflict, how did this particular war kick off in recent weeks? And even as I ask that question, I know that in some ways we're not going to satisfy both sides with the answer, but can you start to at least give us some enlightenment to exactly how did this conflict escalate to the point that both Israel and Hamas are firing rockets at each other?
So it's interesting to look at the names of the war. I think that tells you a lot. In Israel it was called Shomer HaChomot, Guardian of the Walls, and Hamas called it Sword of Jerusalem. So you can clearly see here that both sides are referring to the walls of Jerusalem in their name of the war. So I think in that sense, it's clear that the events of the past month in Jerusalem leading up to when it began on May the 6th was a trigger. So there was three things that happened in the last month, that all of them, I covered, and I visited all the places as well. The first was around the Damascus Gate. The Damascus Gate, for those that haven't been to Jerusalem, is the main entrance way to the old city to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a holy site for Muslims, and especially during Ramadan, it's a place where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people want to pray each night as they break the fast. And it's also the site of the former Jewish temple, making it the holiest site in the world for Jews as well. So that's why it's a contested place. So we're right at the end of Corona now. So almost everyone is vaccinated. It's not really an issue, but there's still a little bit of Corona around. We had like 12 cases yesterday. I know in Victoria you would lock down for that, but here that's considered a huge achievement for us because we used to have thousands a day. So the police decided for a bit for Corona reasons and a bit for crowd control reasons that they wouldn't allow gathering around the steps of Damascus Gate. And for Palestinians, this felt like, it's like saying don't gather at Fed Square on Australia Day or something. For them, it's like this big public area where that's where you go and that's where you hang out, and there's food stalls and clothing, and it's a social place, and they felt that their cultural place was being taken away from them. So for the first 13 nights of Ramadan, every night there was clashes between mainly young Palestinian boys and Israeli police over what they felt was their right to be able to sit at the Damascus Gate. And then after 13 days, Israel eventually lifted the barriers, and they were able to sit at Damascus Gate for the rest of Ramadan. And so that was, people thought, okay, there was a clash and it's over. It's kind of been resolved after sort of Israel backed down there. And then the next issue that came out was the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which I'll talk about in the next question. And then the last issue was the issue of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So on the mosque, as I mentioned, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people want to pray there during Ramadan. And the last few days of Ramadan, which are the holiest nights of the festival, there were several clashes on the Mount. According to the Israeli narrative, this was provoked by Palestinians throwing stones at Israeli soldiers and also stones down at the Kotel with the Western Wall where Jews were praying. And then the soldiers felt that they had to go on the Mount to respond to this violence. According to the Palestinian narrative, this was an unprovoked assault on a holy place where soldiers were coming in with tear gas and stun grenades and even rubber bullets and and going into a mosque, into one of the holiest places. It's the third holiest site in the world for Muslims, and there was a great sense of desecrating a holy place. That a soldier would use, ammunition in a holy place was considered, a violation of Muslim law, and then that resulted in on May the 6th, Hamas firing the first rocket of the war was actually fired at Jerusalem. And I was actually at home on a Zoom call at the time, and very not expecting it, because whilst Israel has had rockets before, they very rarely are fired at Jerusalem. And then that's where everything went on from there. I will say that in the Israeli imagination, I guess they would say that the war has nothing to do with those three things that I mentioned. In Israel, that the common thought is that the reason Hamas attacked Israel is because Hamas is a anti-Semitic genocidal terrorist organization that just wants to destroy Israel. But within the narrative, Hamas, and definitely of Palestinians within Israel and also Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they would say those three issues are the triggers that caused Hamas to sort of stand up to protect Jerusalem.
So the one that you did mention there, which I wanted to ask you about, was the property rights dispute for the neighbourhood in East Jerusalem, which I am going to pronounce and destroy it terribly, and I apologise.
Yeah.
Chef Jarrah, how was that?
Yes. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Thank you. Walk us through the history of this dispute, and why had it impacted on the tensions within Jerusalem in the last couple of weeks?
So the Shafsharach neighborhood is about 10 minutes north of the old city. I work there. My office is in Shafsharach for Kids for Peace. I've been working there for the past 3 years. I go there every day. And so it's a neighborhood I know reasonably well. So within that neighborhood, there's a tomb of a Jewish sage called Shimon HaTzadik. He lived 2,000 years ago. He was one of the priests in the temple. And so for many years, that was probably from the Middle Ages or so, that was a pilgrimage site for Jews to come and pray at the tomb of this holy man. Interestingly, archaeologically, I'm almost sure it's not him who's buried in this tomb, because it was probably someone else, and then probably about 500 years ago it became his tomb. But that happens with a lot of tombs in this place, but that's a whole other story. But there's a belief, at least, that this man is buried there. And so in 1875, a group called the Yemenite Association and the Ashkenazi Association, they bought a giant block of land around this tomb for pilgrims to come and worship the tomb and visit there and pray there, and they had festivals and that sort of thing. And then in 1948, there was a war where during that war, what Israel would call the War of Independence, or Palestinians would call the Nakba, the catastrophe, the Jews that were living in the eastern side of the city were expelled or left, depending on your narrative, and moved to West Jerusalem. And the Palestinians who were living on the western side of the city in neighborhoods like Baka, Katamon, Talbiya, and then also around the whole country in Akka and in Jaffa and Lid and lots of other places, they also became refugees. 700,000 Palestinians became refugees in the Nakba. And there was this, I guess, like population transfer. People moved from one side of the city based on where the ceasefire lines were resolved in 1949. So Jordan, who then controlled this site now around the tomb, decided to give, the blocks was divided into 28 blocks of land, and 28 families who were refugees from that war were given homes in 1956. And in exchange for them getting this getting these homes, they gave up their refugee status. So they stopped being listed as refugees because they now had homes in the Shafsharach neighborhood. And Jordan made a mistake, though, and that's a big part of this conflict, is that they never registered the land directly to these people. So no one got a document saying, like when you buy a house, you have a deed that says this is your house and it's got your name on it. They never got that. They just got the land, and for whatever reason, it wasn't registered. Then in 1967, Israel captures East Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, occupies, as most of the world would consider it, and then the families there then the Jewish owner, the prior Jewish owners, they want the land back. And so in 1970, Israel passes a law that says that any Jew who once owned land in East Jerusalem can evict the owners of that land and reclaim it for themselves. But, and this is important, there isn't a law that allows Palestinians to reclaim their land from West Jerusalem. It's basically a law that, whilst it doesn't say Jew or Arab in it, neither law does, the 1950 law, the 1970 law, it's a law that discriminates against Palestinian and in favour of Israelis. And so while everything I'm saying here is legal, it's based on a law that's not a fair law, because it doesn't treat, not everyone has the same property rights in Jerusalem. So then in 1982, there's an agreement between the Palestinians who live in Sheikh Jarrah and the people that own the land, that the people in Sheikh Jarrah can stay there, provided they pay rent, like a symbolic kind of rent, to the Jewish owners, and they have what's called a protected tenancy status. That means that they're not the owners of the house, but they're allowed to stay there. And the residents don't pay rent. They say, we don't recognize the Israeli occupation. It's illegal under international law. We don't recognize the fact that it's your homes. We were given these homes in 1956 from the Jordanians. We're not paying you rent. And then there's a series of court cases. I won't go through all of them because they literally go for 40 years, leading up to May 6th. What happens on May 6th is there is meant to be on May 6th a verdict to evict 4 Palestinian families from their homes. Now, this has already gone through all of the lower courts, and all of the lower courts have ruled in favour of the Jewish settlers that want to remove them from their homes. And on May 6th, you're meant to get the final verdict of the Supreme Court. And legally, the residents don't have a leg to stand on. Like legally, I'm almost sure that the case will be ruled in favour of the Jewish settlers. But morally, they argue that it's the reason they don't have a legal leg to stand on is because the law that the court is interpreting is not a law that's a fair law. It's a law that allows Jews to reclaim property in East Jerusalem, but doesn't allow Palestinians to reclaim property in West Jerusalem. And that is what then triggered the Hamas firing the rockets, at least in their narrative. And I will say for Palestinians, even though I'm not Palestinian, I've spoken to many Palestinians about Sheikh Jarrah, and many of them feel like what's happening in this neighbourhood is the Nakba all over again. For them, this brings up a sense that Israel is trying to, in 1948 it was by force, and now it's by legal means, but trying to make East Jerusalem more Jewish in order to prevent East Jerusalem from becoming the capital of Palestine and prevent them from living their lives in the way they are. And so the reason why many Palestinians are worried about Sheikh Jarrah is because they say, even though now it's only 4 houses, what if it's my house next month or next year? Or, there's a court case in Silwan today, which is another neighbourhood in East Jerusalem. And there's a fear that this might start, if the court rules in favour of the settlers now in Sheikh Jarrah, it could start a wave of house removals from other neighbourhoods in East Jerusalem. And that's the fear. In the Israeli narrative, if you look at all the statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and members of the Jerusalem City Council, they will say this is a real estate dispute between a tenant and a landlord over non-payment of rent, and there's nothing political about it, in the same way that you have property disputes anywhere else in the world.
Jerusalem Day marks the reunification of the whole city after the end of the Six-Day War in 1967, and that was celebrated just recently. And I read a lot of reports that in the days leading up to it, you mentioned before about young Palestinian kids stockpiling rocks in the Alaska Mosque, and at the same time you've got religious nationalist Jews sort of marching through the city in the lead up to the celebration of Jerusalem Day. How much of an impact did these two young sort of groups have in escalating the tensions that led to then the war?
So I spent most of the day in and around the old city of Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day. I'll say a few things. Firstly, it's always a tense day because, as you mentioned, for Jewish modern Orthodox Zionist Jerusalem, which is not the majority of the city, but that part of the city, and then also the many modern Orthodox religious youth that come from around the country to march with flags on Jerusalem, it's not just a day of celebration, it's also a day celebrating a conquest and a dispossession of the Palestinian people from Jerusalem, especially from the Kotel, which was once the Western Wall, where there was the Mughrabi neighborhood. There was a Palestinian neighborhood in front, and now is a plaza where Jews from all over the world come to pray and worship. And it's really, many, many young Jewish boys and girls come from all over the world to have their bar and bat mitzvah there. And there's a sense of great joy that this has finally returned to the Jewish people. And I'd say few Jews would visit that place without tearing up or feeling emotional, given that it's it's the last remaining wall of the former Jewish temple, and that's really what's being celebrated on Jerusalem. Sadly, within the people celebrating, there are a group of ultra-Jewish nationalists that celebrate it by marching through Arab areas and chanting really awful slogans. Muhammad is dead, death to Arabs, death to terrorists. Mishema min lo mefached, whoever believes isn't afraid. Ama netzach lo mefached, the eternal nation isn't afraid. But it's kind of nationalistic slogans that kind of affirm to the Palestinians that this is ours and this is not yours. And then obviously Palestinians will respond to that with violence. Or in fact, when I was in the old city around 2 PM, every Arab shop had closed. They were just like, we don't want any problems, and the area looked like a ghost town about an hour before the march. And so what Israel did was, firstly, there were two things. There was a group called Tag Meir, which is a sort of more left-wing Jewish group, and about 2 hours before the nationalist march, they marched through the old city with flowers to sort of try and promote tolerance and coexistence and say, we are Jews. There was about 400 Jews there kind of saying, we believe Jerusalem should belong to everyone. These flowers are a symbol of peace. And then, a few hours later, tens of thousands of people marched through the old city with Israeli flags. But in order to not cause trouble, Israel actually rerouted the march. So instead of going through the Damascus Gate, which is the Muslim quarter, it went through the Jaffa Gate and the Zion Gate. So the Israeli government was sort of trying to not pour oil on the flame by making sure that march didn't go through the area, hoping that would sort of calm down the people who were upset about this march happening in the first place. That obviously didn't calm down Hamas because they still fired rockets anyway, but that was what happened on that day.
I've got a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask you about that are sort of more at a sort of a geopolitical kind of global sense, because you've given us a good picture of what things were like on the ground, but then obviously there are multiple levels in this conflict, and I want to start to sort of unpick those and pose them to you more as a narrative from different sides and get your sense of the impact that it's having. The first one is that how much responsibility do you think the Israeli government can bear in terms of allowing this to escalate on the streets of Jerusalem, particularly the actions of the local police during those final critical days in the holy month of Ramadan?
So in Israel, there's a very extreme politician that was elected in the last election that he kind of makes Pauline Hanson look moderate. His name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he's from the Religious Zionism Party. And he opened up his office in Sheikh Jarrah, opposite the homes of the Palestinian families that were going to be expelled. And there's videos of him kind of yelling at them in Hebrew, Zeh shelanu, Zeh shelanu, like this land is ours. And so when you get an ultra-nationalist politician going to the most sensitive neighborhood, setting up an office there with a flag and saying, this is our, it's clearly a provocative act. And this is someone that Netanyahu wants to be in his coalition. And Netanyahu didn't condemn, this behavior. The police chief did, by the way. The police chief said that Itamar Ben-Gvir shouldn't be doing this, and this is just going to inflame tensions. But he did this. Some of his followers in a group called Lehava were marching through the city and saying "Death to Arabs." A couple of weeks ago, about 300 of them, which kind of had echoes of Charlottesville in the sense of I was really frightened just to see that happening in Jerusalem, because the majority of Jewish Jerusalem does not think like that. But a very extremist thing. And then obviously on the Palestinian side, there's a sense of we need to defend Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under attack, and the Palestinians don't have an army in Jerusalem. They don't have police. And so they feel like the way they can defend themselves is through rocks and stones and also demonstrations and chanting and waving Palestinian flags and that sort of thing. And then you get to the clashes where they were. So If we had leaders that wanted to calm things down, I think that would be better on both sides. But for various reasons, a big one is also, I should mention that there was meant to be a Palestinian election as well, which was meant to happen on May 22nd, which Mahmoud Abbas cancelled. And it seems quite clear that Hamas was actually going to do very well in that election. And the reason the election was cancelled is Mahmoud Abbas didn't want to lose it. This is a guy who hasn't had an election for 17 years, by the way. And so I think there was a lot of hope, and there was a lot of people organizing before the election. I think there was like 30 parties that already registered to run. And then especially for Hamas, I think they felt like we were going to express our voice, and the many other people who don't like Fatah and the PLO, we were going to express our voice through these elections. And then these elections got taken away from us. So what's our way to express our voice? Well, everything else you saw in the past month.
Yeah, I mean, that was the next question I was going to ask you about that. I mean, how much did the cancelling of the Palestinian elections impact on the conflict? And it's just, like the Fatah Party at an international level are a sister party with all the Labour and Social Democratic parties around the world. They are a member of the International Progressive Alliance, which is the Australian Labor Party and the Labor Party in the UK, the Israeli Labor Party, the Democrats, all of those kind of left-wing parties are affiliated too. So they're a sister party. Yeah. And as a liberal Democrat, as in a person who believes in democracy, you want to see democracy flourish. And you did make the point that Mahmoud Abbas is serving the 16th year of a 4-year term, which I think a lot of politicians would be quite jealous about, quite frankly. If I don't have to have as many elections, then that's going to be great for me. But, you want democracy to flourish in the Palestinian Authority and in the West Bank and in Gaza. But then the risk is that they lose and it falls into the hands of more fundamentalist groups.
Right. And look, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem explicitly said in an interview that she didn't want the elections to happen there. She didn't want people of East Jerusalem to vote either, because she doesn't want people of East Jerusalem to feel like they belong to the Palestinian Authority. And she was also fearful of the election. So I'm sure there were probably many other Israelis that were happy that election didn't happen as well.
Yeah. The next question I'm going to ask you about is the Abraham Accords, and what level of frustration has that created for the Palestinian leadership? And for listeners at home, you can explain to us what those accords were and the international diplomatic strategy that Israel has taken in terms of trying to broaden a new path of Arab-Jewish relations in the Middle East and trying to end this perpetual violence. How much of that has that impacted on the role that the Palestinian leadership plays within their own community?
So the Abraham Accords were normalization agreements signed between Trump and the UAE and Bahrain in exchange for recognizing the state of Israel, and also then allow them to open up trade with the United States at a much higher level, specifically around issues of weapons and defense. And then after the first two countries, there were two other countries that joined on later, being Morocco and Sudan. Sudan hasn't been finalized. It's in the process at the moment, but they're heading towards normalization with Israel. So now, for example, you can fly from Israel to Dubai, something that you couldn't do until a few months ago. And I think Trump was a very key factor, because I think a lot of these countries felt that if Trump wasn't there, this is not something that we could necessarily do. And that's why a lot of them happened, towards the last few months of his term in office. And in Netanyahu, I think the left in Israel has always argued you can't make peace without making peace with the Palestinians. You make peace with your enemy. You don't make peace with your friends. And Netanyahu, his whole campaign was, I've shown that I can make peace with the Arabs without making peace with the Palestinians. I've shown that I can bring normalization agreements in several countries and recognition from around the world without sort of ending the occupation or removing settlements or any of those sorts of things. And for a while, a lot of Israelis believed that, and a lot of Israelis thought maybe we are living in an era of peace. And I think those Abraham Accords were very popular in Israel. Even many of the parties on the left supported them as well, because there was that sense of, well, any peace agreement is always better, and you never know the impact it will have down the road in the future. And I think what this last month has reminded us is that having peace with Dubai, Bahrain, does not stop Hamas from firing rockets, or also, I mean, the internal violence within Israel, which I'll speak about in a minute. But that ultimately, to have peace, you need to make peace with the people that you live in this land with, and that you share this land with. And that, as wonderful as peace might be with countries somewhere else in the Gulf, that's not enough.
There's a narrative that I read in some of the Israeli papers in the last couple of weeks, is that the key funders of Hamas, Turkey and Iran, obviously are not keen on seeing a new path forward in terms of Arab-Jewish relations, and that this escalation and this war, in part, was to show the rest of the world that Israel is not a partner in peace in the Middle East, that they are this aggressor, and let's just I guess by Hamas starting to fire rockets into Jerusalem or into Israel, they know they're not going to win, but they know they're going to get a response, and it's the response that will impact those relationships.
You're right. Look, on the last day of the war, Hamas, the day after the war, Hamas released a statement saying they'd won the war, and in the statement where they said they'd won the war, they said one of the things that they said they've achieved is we've made sure that no other Arab country will normalize relations with Israel. So we've stopped this. If there were any other Arab countries considering it, they're not going to do this now. Interestingly, also the day after the war ended, Amit Segal, who is sort of a well-known right-wing political commentator in Israel, he said on Sunday, Israel is going to have to make two decisions. The first is it going to allow Jews to pray on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, near the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, again, for Jews, the Temple Mount, the holiest site in the world for the Jewish people? And is it going to let the courts approve the evictions from Sheikh Jarrah? He said quite clearly, if Israel doesn't do these two things, allow Jews to pray on the Temple Mount and evict people from Sheikh Jarrah, then Hamas has won. Now, interestingly, on Sunday morning, Israel did allow Jews again to pray on the Temple Mount around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There were some clashes when that happened, but about, I think, 50 to 100 Jews did pray, not pray on that site, sorry, they sort of toured the site, but they didn't sort of hold a prayer, because you're not allowed to pray on the site. The Sheikh Jarrah decision, again, we'll know in 2 weeks where the Supreme Court rules, and I'm guessing there may be some intervention from the Attorney General, Abichai Mandelblit, in that case, now that it's so politically sensitive. But there is a sense, I guess, for the right wing in Israel that we can't make any concessions on Sheikh Jarrah or the Temple Mount, because this will show that Hamas won. And Israel wants the right-wing government for sure wants to tell its people that we won, and these are the two core issues where I guess they can say we won, in addition to obviously stopping Hamas from being able to fire rockets at Ashdod and Ashkelon and so many of the residents of the south that have, suffered terribly, not just in the last month, but for over 20 years from these rockets.
One of the most disturbing reports, I think, a lot of it's disturbing, so I'm not trying to have some sort of moral Olympics here, but one of the disturbing reports I thought coming out of it was the inter-Nicene violence that was springing up in mixed Jewish Arab towns in Israel, where the majority population is Arab, like towns like Lod, where we're seeing riots between the community, synagogues being torched, mobs attacking, an old Arab man, reports of him being lynched. This is one of the journalists, one of the Israeli journalists reported about that. I think he said that the existential crisis for Israel is not Hamas, but it is our internals, that if we cannot keep peace within our communities, then that's going to be a problem for Israel going forward. How is this something that leadership within the Israeli government that they would sit up and go, okay, this is not great. We need to address this? Because I don't think I get a feeling from Bibi that he really does care about ending this cycle of violence that exists. These flare-ups that happen every 4 or 5 years between Israel and Hamas. But is he going to pay attention to what's going on in his own country?
So, a few things. Firstly, there was also a civil war here, in addition to the war with Hamas, you're right, in Ramleh, in Lod, in Akko, in Haifa, and so many in the mixed cities there was violence. There was in Bat Yam, there was a lynching. An Arab man was pulled out of his car and beaten with sticks and clubs almost to an inch of his life, purely because he was an Arab. And one of the people, involved in this happened live on television, by the way. And one of the people who beat him up was interviewed later, and they said, well, why are you beating up a random person? He said, well, the Arabs are firing rockets at us, so I have to find an Arab to kind of to show that I'm not going anywhere, that I'm here to stay. Crazy rhetoric, because what does an Arab in Bat Yam have to do with Hamas? It's a ridiculous argument. At the same time, in Lod, there were several synagogues burnt. Synagogues where no one was in them, but just burning synagogues. There was stones were thrown at Jews. There was also a number of lynchings of Jews in Akko. Almost every single Jewish restaurant or business in the old city was destroyed. Glass smashed, etc. So really, really horrific internal violence. And again, Hamas very much saw that as a victory of saying, we've united the West Bank, 48, Israel in 67, by bringing everyone together under our leadership. And that again is, in a way, it's them waging election politics without an election. And especially someone that works in a civil society organization where, this happened before in October 2000, and a lot of civil society groups formed to kind of say, we need to work better on making this country a home for everyone, Jews and Arabs, men and women, making sure that everyone feels equal here. There were many dialogue groups, joined Jewish Arab schools formed in response to this. And there's a great sense of what happened here. In terms of Netanyahu, when this happened, Netanyahu issued a very strong statement on live television saying, I condemn all violence. No one should be beating anyone up. This is not our way. But then on the other hand, look at what he's done for the last 20 years. Look at the people he sits in coalition with. Look at the Jewish nation state law that he passed that, demotes the status of Arabic in the country. Look at the Nakba law. Look at various other laws and rhetoric that comes from people within his own party that is extremely anti-Arab. So on the one hand, he condemns the violence, but on the other hand, he lays the framework for delegitimizing, I guess, Arabs from being part of the coalition, even though the Rum party very much wants to be part of the coalition, but also delegitimizing Arabs as citizens as well, as calling them terror supporters and that sort of thing. And, when you push enough, then you get these responses. On the other hand, nothing justifies burning a synagogue or beating up a Jew on the street or these sorts of things. So again, it's a very complicated situation, but I don't think Netanyahu has been in any way a unifying leader or a leader that's tried to, he's only sort of calming down the flames after they're well and truly lit.
This is a simplistic question that I'm going to pose to you, or a statement, and I'd want to get your thoughts on it and tear it apart if you feel free. But are the two biggest obstacles to the peace process and a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine Netanyahu and Hamas?
Yes, but not. It's because Netanyahu and Hamas won't be there forever. Netanyahu will eventually lose an election or resign, and Hamas will get replaced by something. I think beyond that, beyond what these two organizations are, it is an issue of trust. There is zero trust now between Israeli and Palestinian people, and definitely between their leaderships, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And you can't have a peace process without trust, because anything that you would sign with the other side, if you believe the other side is not going to keep their commitment, they're not going to keep their security guarantee or remove their settlement or whatever agreement that you made, you wouldn't sign anything. And I know, I studied the peace process in Northern Ireland and actually took a group from Kids for Peace there to talk to them. And I think one of the things that struck me most was we sat with a Catholic and a Protestant member of Parliament in Stormont. These are people that, once were trying to kill each other, and now they were both ministers in a government. And they said, before we did our peace negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, we talked about each other's families, and we had meals together, and we built trust. And I feel like that's what's that's what's missing. And that's what we try and do with Kids for Peace as well. We try and build trust, build connections between families, celebrate each other's festivals together. That's like what I call soft power. It's not hard power, but I think you can't have a peace process if you don't have the people behind it. And one of the reasons why Oslo blew up in everyone's faces is because, you know, the whole thing was done in secret. When the agreement was signed, very few Israelis and Palestinians even knew that the negotiations had been happening for several years. And in Israel, definitely, whilst there was some support for it initially, you know, as the peace process went on, became very unpopular, and Rabin was eventually assassinated. And also on the Palestinian side, you know, they felt that this was going to lead them to have an independent state of Palestine and to not have settlements on their land. And they also didn't see that happening. And so then Hamas came with the terrorism and all the bus bombings and those sorts of things. So I think the big thing is trust, and how you build trust between two peoples that have been fighting for so long is really, really hard. And the only way you can do that is through grassroots activism. But you know, we're a tiny minority in amongst a population that doesn't trust anymore.
It's you know, it's funny you mentioned Northern Ireland, because I've been thinking about that in the days leading up to you and I having a conversation. I mean, that's my background. And you're right. I mean, it was trust. And look, the Good Friday Agreement is it is an imperfect agreement, and it's an imperfect peace in the north, but it's a stepping stone, and it's getting closer, and it is getting better. And I was there in 2003, and I went back there last year, and I noticed a difference in talking to folks on the ground. It's changed a lot. The new generation are coming through, and there's greater intermingling between the different communities. Yeah. The other thing that the Good Friday Agreement was successful in doing was everyone around that negotiating table had to compromise. They had to give up things that were important to them, and big things as well. I think about the Republican movement. They had to give up they had to create a constitutional amendment change that the South had a claim on the North about reunification. That was a huge thing. And the second thing was for the Republican movement to agree that the people within the 6 counties of Northern Ireland could have self-determination. That's not an easy thing to do, you know. And I just look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine. I think at this point in time, I feel like they are so far. This is probably the furthest point, and I'd be glad to get your thoughts on this. I feel like this is the furthest point they've ever been, the two communities, from reaching any kind of peace settlement. There's a study done by one of the think tanks in Washington that I'd read a year or two ago that tracks attitudes between Jews and Arabs in Israel and Palestine over the last 30 years, and it's got worse. Like, there was a period in the early 2000s where, you know, 60% of Palestinians and Israelis had a reasonably favourable opinion of each other. But it's got worse since then, and I just think that's an absence of leadership on both sides. And I just and you know, trying to find solutions here. I mean, you're right. It's got to come from the grassroots. But man, the work that you're doing and the work that a whole bunch of other people are doing, it feels like you're a kite dancing in the wind. You know, it's tough work.
Yeah, look, you're right. It is very hard work, and the people are, you know, say peace now seems far more removed and unlikely than, you know, any other time I can remember in recent history. And that to me, as a person living here and raising my children here, is very sad. I think, you know, Daniel Gordis, an American Israeli commentator, wrote a piece this week saying, you know, maybe we don't need peace. Maybe we can just live here without peace and just have a war every 3 to 5 years, and then maybe that's our lot in life, and maybe we should just give up on this dream of peace because we live in a neighborhood where our neighbors, you know, there's no one to talk to, and you know, we can't make compromises on things that are essential to us, and I think a lot of Israelis feel that way. For Palestinians, not having peace means house demolitions, it means potential evictions from their homes, it means inequality, it means, you know, limits on rights to work and travel from Gaza and the West Bank. So for them, not having peace is also not having equality as well, which is also something that they desperately want. But, you know, we have a long way to go, and it's very hard to have hope. And when there's no hope, that's when you get to violence. You know, hope is this, like, a very intangible thing, hope. because you can't really put it in a bottle. But when someone believes that if there's even a 5% chance that you can resolve this around a negotiating table, then they say, okay, I hope it works. But then when it doesn't work, then you say, okay, what's my alternative? My alternative is what? War and violence and defend myself. And then you get what you do. But, a story I often tell is, if you look at Australia, I very much believe in marriage equality. And I remember there was a poll done in I think, 2004, when this was an issue in the Labor Party as well. And I think like 40% or something supported marriage equality. And then by 2017, when we had the referendum, 61% supported marriage equality. And then I think, how did Australia change in 15 years? How did 20% of the population shift from being against marriage equality to being in favour of it? Well, hundreds of people, came out to their families, and you saw LGBT people on TV, and you saw major companies like Qantas and other companies coming out in favour of this, and there was a shift in the public conversation that kind of shifted enough people that 61% supported this. And since the Gaza war ended, I saw two little things that gave me hope. The first was from Cellcom, which is like the Telstra of Israel. It's like a very big phone company, and they made a statement kind of saying Jews and Arabs refuse to be enemies, and said any of our workers that want to strike for a day, in solidarity with a strike that was going on at the time for equality, we support them to be able to do that, even they didn't support the actual Arab strike, but they said that they could strike. And then Harel, which is like a huge insurance company, kind of like Perpetual, I guess, in Australia, they also took out huge billboards saying, the best insurance against violence is coexistence. So you do have sort of some big companies now coming out and saying, look, we've got to work out, neither of us are leaving. Between the river and the sea now, there are 51% Jewish, 49% Arab. So it's pretty much equal if you look at the whole territory as one unit. And so we've got to work out a way to coexist and to live here with equality. And it's very much it's a long, long way ahead to get there. But I think that's what we need to struggle for. And I think our friends, anyone that cares about this place who doesn't live here, should also be struggling for that as well with us.
I mean, it certainly does get the attention, and this particular flare-up has, I don't know if social media was so prominent when the last time there was engagement between Israel and Hamas, but this time around I did notice on social media that everyone was, sharing their memes and all that kind of stuff. One thing I did notice, and I want to get your thoughts on this, and maybe we'll wrap it up after this, is if you believe sections of social media, particularly on the left, then there's this narrative that Israel is an apartheid state. It's not a democracy. That its citizens are white European fascist colonizers illegally possessing the land of brown people, Middle Eastern people, and the Zionists, backed by the United States, are the facilitators of this evil. And when it all boils down to a narrative, you need a protagonist and you need an antagonist, and in this case, it's as simple as good versus evil. Looking at that, what angered me was and I did see the same on the sort of the Israeli side as well. I was getting a lot of sort of this narrative about Arabs and Palestinians and the like. It just makes it so much harder to try and find those the peacemakers in this journey when social media is just driving even all of us around the world further and further apart, because there's always, you read the comments, oh my God, it's a shit fight. It's a dumpster fire of opinions, and it just doesn't help what you guys, particularly, the example of what you're doing in Jerusalem with the Kids for Peace. It must just drive you insane trying to say, hey guys, can we just try and keep some level head here? What's been your thoughts as you've been looking at social media and the role it's been playing in this conflict?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of people who are not Israeli or Palestinian who view Israel-Palestine as a bit like a football match, like a Collingwood kind of thing, where they, you pick a team and then the other team is evil, and then you barrack for your team no matter what they do. And then you lose all sense of complexity and nuance, and then you get sort of those tweets and Instagram infographics like you spoke there. I don't think that's particularly helpful. In fact, I wrote an article about this just last week saying, if you want to understand Israel-Palestine, go to a news site, like news sites that have journalists who are on the ground, who are actually reporting. if you want an Arab-Palestinian perspective, you can read Al Jazeera. If you want an Israeli perspective, you can read, the Times of Israel, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post. There's many websites in English, but try and get your news from journalists, not from celebrities and Instagram infographics and that sort of thing. But the way the world works is people unfortunately don't go to the news site. They look at their social media feeds or their TikTok or whatever, and then they think that what their friends post is what's news, rather than actually going to reading the news site. In relation to the apartheid thing, so specifically with Sheikh Jarrah, there is an issue there that the law is not equal. The law that allows this family to be removed from their home is a discriminatory law. So I understand why a lot of people are opposed to that law, as am I personally as well. I don't think it's a fair law that allows you to commit an injustice today in order to avenge an injustice that was committed 70 years ago. I think that's a terrible principle to set in law, because it can lead to a lot of people being removed from their laws. On the other hand, within the 67 borders, Israel is a democracy. Is there racism? For sure. Is there discrimination against Arab citizens? I think we can see that very, very, very clearly. And in the same way that there's racism and discrimination in Australia against certain minorities, I'm sure many Indigenous Australians would say that Australia is, still has laws that they would consider racist about removal of children and those sorts of things as well. So it's a very flawed democracy, I would say, within Israel. In the West Bank and Gaza, it's not a democracy. The Jews in the West Bank who live in the settlements do have different rights from the Palestinians, even though they're neighbours in terms of, access to water and resources and roads and all of these sorts of things. So is the whole country an apartheid state? I don't think so. But is there legal inequality in many parts of it? Yes. Israel would argue that inequality is not racially based, which is true. It's not because you're black or white or anything like that. It's because Israel feels like those laws are necessary for security in order to protect the Jews who live in the West Bank and in Israel. And the Palestinians would say that those laws are there to ethnically cleanse them and to remove them from their land and take their properties. And that's how those two narratives come about.
Last question. Where do you go next with the work in terms of Kids for Peace in Jerusalem off the back of a conflict such as this? Where do you start?
So one of my colleagues, Sulma, who I work with in Kids for Peace, lives in Sheikh Jarrah, and she, whilst not her family facing eviction, the next court case will be her house. And so, it's very difficult for her to work in a peace organisation when this is happening to her family. And I feel terrible that my government is doing this to her. And I know what she's experienced in the last few months with the riots and constant violence outside her house. There's now blockades in front of the neighborhood. So even to get in and out of her house, she has to go through checkpoints to get, medicine for her father. Everything is regulated by police. There was sadly a 16-year-old girl who was shot in the back last week when she was in her house even, but a police officer shot her in the back with a rubber bullet because he said that she didn't go into her house quickly enough. And that policeman has been stood down now, but horrific levels of violence in the neighbourhood at the moment, which I obviously want to see stop. So look, I still believe in the work. I still believe that the only way you can end this conflict is by talking to one another and bringing people together. But I have to be honest, I'm in a minority. I'm not the majority in this country, but I don't see any other way to make it better. Like if we, because no one's gonna force anyone out of their homes as a long-term solution. That's not how you're gonna live here. That's just gonna result in continued clashes and violence and all of those sorts of things. And I want to see Jerusalem be a home for all of its citizens. I know that sounds like a radical thing to say now, but I think that's everyone has to have equal rights, no matter what their religion, and everyone should be represented in the government as well. Like people, because that's what happens when you don't have political representation, and then you try and express yourself through other means. That you need to have a political system. I think there should be Arab parties in the coalition in Israel, whether it's Ram or the Joint List, right, left, I don't mind, but everyone has to have a voice in the government that rules their lives. And if you don't have that voice, then you get to the situation where we're in. And to me, that's not acceptable, because I think we deserve to live in peace, and so do the Palestinians.
Hear, hear. Is there any way in which Australians or our listeners around the world can contribute or support the work that you guys are doing? I've put you on the spot there. I'm not sure we can donate or, but
look, there is something actually. I know when this happens, a lot of people call for boycotting Israel, or boycotting Hamas, or boycotting the Palestinians, or boycotting Iran. Like, a lot of people want to decide that they don't like. They want to withdraw funding, and all of those sorts of things. And I understand why definitely Australia shouldn't be funding terrorist organisations, and aid money should be going to the right places. And I know that's been issues in the past, but I would say beyond that, in addition to just boycotting, you should also be investing. Like, Australia is not a major power in the world, but it is a mid power, and I think there are organisations like ours connected to the Alliance for Middle East Peace, called ALMEP, where there's over 100 NGOs working on the ground. That recently there was the Nita Lowey bill in the US, talked about a major increase of funding to these peace organisations. And I think if Australians did want to help resolve the situation, and also within the Labor Party, I think calling for more support for all MEP organisations that work on the ground, whether it's through Jewish Arab schools, through dialogue groups, through churches, synagogues, women's groups, groups that talk about equality and human rights, groups that educate children to learn Hebrew, to learn Arabic, to see the other person as a human being, there's sports groups together, there's dance groups, basketball, all sorts of things that I think work on the ground. And just going back to Northern Ireland, there was an international fund for peace in Northern Ireland that Kennedy, established already in the 70s, that really brought a lot of work was done through the churches to bring people together before there was any peace agreement that allowed the grassroots. And when they had the referendum on the Good Friday Agreement, I think 71% voted in favour of it. So, if today there was a referendum on peace, I can assure you the numbers would not be 71%. So I think if you want peace in 20 years, you've got to start now supporting people on the ground, and also supporting leaders calling for calm, calling for making statements, that say Israel should do all it can to stop the evictions from Sheikh Jarrah. Hamas has to stop firing rockets. People need to stop making racist statements. People need to work together and restore peace and calm. And I think the more that that's said by the international community, the better, because I see that as an act of concern for the people that live here. And I think at least the Israeli government does listen to what friends like people in Australia will say, because we know that people in Australia care about us and want us to be safe, and want us to live in prosperity and harmony with our neighbours.
Ittay, we need more people like you over there. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. We do appreciate it. And if maybe we'll put up a website or something in the description of today's episode where people can find out some more information about both articles to read on the issue and also ways in which you can donate and support the work of Peace for Kids.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, and wishing you well in Australia. I know you're in a lockdown again with your 4 cases or something there, but I hope you can all get vaccinated soon, and that you can again. Firstly, I want to visit Australia, and it's very hard for me to do that right now, but also that you can visit here as well.
Good stuff.